So recently I finally finished my first portrait, and it was pretty hard to do. But I did learn a new technique to make the portrait look way better, and in this video I want to learn you this too. So let's see the result of the portrait. Now as you can see in the portrait, it's looking pretty sharp. And as you can already tell, the technique that I use is the rence technique. So this kind of means that I'm making a grid with all kinds of squares. This way it makes it way easier to use references, since it's just a smaller area that you just need to fill in. So let's see how it works. So what are the things you're gonna need for this tutorial of grid? Well, as you might have guessed, you will need a ruler and some pencils. That's basically it. Okay, so let's start. I'm gonna make some 1 centimeter squares for this tutorial. When you're drawing a bigger portrait, you might want to get some bigger squares, but for the purpose of this video, 1 centimeter squares should be sufficient. So as you might have guessed, it's quite easy. You just start with drawing some rectangles and that's about it. So let's just do that now. Now these squares aren't perfect. Do make sure that yours are. The better these squares are, the easier it's gonna be for you to draw from your reference. Now for the purpose of this video, these squares are good enough. So I'm just gonna leave it at this. Now there are a few different ways to get a grid. You can just get your references out of the printer and make a grid on it yourself. You could use a reference image on the internet with a grid already on it. Or you could use an app. Now there are multiple apps for this, but any will do. Now personally, for the reference, I would like to use an app. For the portrait that I just shown you, I did use a reference from the internet, but that was just basically to make it easier for me. And what you can do is select a photo, and from this photo you can just make a grid on it. So let's find a photo to just make a grid for. Now I'm gonna use this image. It's an easy image to draw, so it will get the point across. Now for this app I can set in how many squares I have. And since we did 5 squares, I'm gonna type in 5. Now and as you can see, it makes the grid smaller. So let's use this image and see what we can get done. Now the best part of this technique is that you can reference in a smaller area. This way it makes it a lot easier to just get the details down to what you want. So I'm just gonna only draw the bottom car since that's easiest. So as you can see, you can make out that this is about 10% of the whole square. So now you know you can start here. Same goes for the bottom part here, it's about 50% of the square. So that way you can draw down to the bottom of the car for 50% of the square. You make a small turn, and this way this is what you do for the whole square. So basically you just keep referencing a smaller area of your grid. So let's do that for a while. Now it is always better to get the grid over your whole image and not what I'm doing with this smaller area. The more squares you have, the easier it's going to be to reference to a smaller point. But don't make them too small. If you go too small, this will just make it way more complicated for your drawing and you will need to erase a lot of lines. So find a good middle ground for you. Now I've copied the image, and as you can see, it was easier to just reference to where you need to be. Now this drawing is not an exact copy, and I'm not going to spend the time to make it perfect since I have limited time today. But I think it got the point across of what a reference can do for you with a grid. Now the next step is to erase the lines. Now this depends on what drawing you're making. If you have a drawing like this, you will need to erase the lines. If you have a portrait, you might be able to blend this graphite into your picture, like I did with mine, which makes it a lot more easier afterwards to not ruin your drawing that you just made. But in my case, I'm gonna erase the lines. And there you have it, a copy of what you just wanted to draw with a grid. Now there are some cases where you would not use a grid. So, for example, like this, you don't need it since it's a simple image. But with a more complicated image, like a portrait or a face of someone, this technique can make it a lot more easier for you to get the details for where they need to be. For example, by drawing an eye, it can be very important to get just the right angle of the light from reflection. This can be hard to just eyeball, so a reference picture with a grid might help you with that. So this technique does take some time, but I would recommend using it. Do make sure that your squares are actually 2 centimeters tall and big every single time. If one is just a small bit off, your whole drawing will just be wonky. So please make sure that you spend a lot of time on getting those squares just right. It will save you so much time in the long run. So if you're planning on making a portrait, use a grid. It's way better, it makes it way easier to draw the portrait and fine-tune it on the small details. So I would definitely recommend you using this technique. So let me know in the comments what you think of this method. Have you ever used it? Was it any useful to you? Let me know. And I'll see you guys in the next video. Bye! Square 2 centimeters, another one 1 square meters.